Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the 2021 IVI Methods Summit, which is entitled Designing Equitable Measures and Methods for Patient Priorities in Healthcare Value Assessment. We're so pleased that over 200 folks from a variety of stakeholder communities have registered for today's event, and we're looking forward to a robust discussion. My job this morning is to kind of frame what brought us to today and to, of course, thank those that helped us along the way. IVI is a 501c3 research organization. Through our research and our development of open source value assessment models, we endeavor to put patients at the center of value assessment. We are funded by our members, and we appreciate all of the resources, both thought leadership and funding resources that help us do our research and put on programs like today. We are especially indebted to PCORI for their Eugene Washington Engagement Award, which helped to underwrite today's program. I also want to acknowledge and thank sincerely the efforts of our Summit Steering Committee, who you can see listed here. They represent a wide spectrum of perspectives and engagement in this field, and they brought wonderful thought leadership and insight into how to build today's program and also how to do outreach to ensure that we had a rich and diverse participant base. So one of my jobs this morning is to kind of build a picture of how we got to today. First of all, last February, before the pandemic took us all offline, IVI hosted its first Methods Summit, and our focus was really where were the priorities for how we improve both the science and the practice of value assessment, a very tall order. But I'm pleased to tell you that we had a number of areas where there was consensus across all the engaged stakeholder groups, which were quite diverse. And the number one priority was that we need to improve data inputs, particularly those perspectives about experience in care and meaningful measures that affect both quality of life and clinical outcomes for patients, families, and caregivers. We're not the only ones that have been talking about this, obviously, and we don't pretend to be. I wanted to acknowledge that, PCORI, as I said, one of our funders for today's program, recently put forth a set of principles that reflect their expanded focus. And principle 1 and 3 in particular that you can see on your screen are relevant to today's discussion, that we need to expand our understanding of the full range of outcomes that are relevant to patients. And we need to better understand the best methods and efforts for data collection that are going to help all of us ensure that we have meaningful and real perspective of patients inside our scientific research and inside our decision-making. I also wanted to reflect on the fact that I think this conversation is coming at an important and unique time where, through the pandemic, we have learned a lot about patient heterogeneity. We've learned a lot about the importance of having a variety of no wrong door entry points for patients to receive care, i.e. telehealth. But we've also seen an explosion in the ways that data is collected about patients, for patients, with patients. And so this ecosystem that we're talking about is both complex, but I think the main takeaway from this slide, which I'll give credit to McKinsey and Company for developing, and we adapted it, is that the patient is really at the center. Again, we are not the only organization that is talking about this and leaning into the notion of how do we improve patient perspectives and inputs into research, into our decision-making processes. These are but a few of the organizations that are involved. And if you're not listed, please don't be offended. It's just a space on a slide. But I want to acknowledge that there are many points of light here. And we think that today's conversation is a unique opportunity to bring a number of threads together and explore where are the priorities in our research, in the collection of data, and in the leveraging of that data to make good decisions. So I'd like to welcome on screen Rick Chapman, our Chief Science Officer, to talk a little bit more about the problem case for today before we hear from our keynote speaker. Rick.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to all of you for attending today. So what's the problem that we're here to talk about? And where do we want to end up? I think we could all agree that our ultimate goal is to provide the right healthcare to the right patient at the right time. And to do that, we must include patient perspectives in our decision-making and in our measurement of quality and value. And right now, you could say that we're kind of drowning in data. Patient data is everywhere, but at the same time, it could be considered nowhere. It's not at the center of what we're going to look at. And if you go to the next slide, you can see here an illustration that came from our pre-reads that really points out some of what goes on here. This is really a look at kind of the data ecosystem and how digital data moves around the system. And you can find the patient on this chart, but and it's kind of in the center, but I think you could argue that the patient's getting lost in a lot of this as the data moves around. And we want to be able to put the patient and family and caregivers information at the center of decision-making and really make sure that that's being taken into account. So we want to make sure that we can make this data more available and accessible to all of the payers or decision makers and stakeholders in the healthcare system, and really avoid this kind of morass that we see here. And if you go to the next slide, you can see really where we're trying to get to. Right now, we know that we've got a lot of information that we're measuring, but a lot of that information is not meaningful to patients. And we have some idea of what is meaningful to patients, but we know that in many cases that's not being measured. And so really what we'd like to do today is talk about how can we increase the overlap between these two circles here, really get to that point in the middle where we have the patient important input and data that matters to patients and their families, and that is also fit for the purpose of decision makers who need to make decisions in healthcare about what interventions are going to be available to patients. And so what I'd like you to think about today as we go through this is, how can we make concrete steps to really move to move that overlap and make that bigger? And so as we do that today, if you go on to the next slide, you can see that our goals for today are to build on current efforts and align priorities. As Jen pointed out, there's a lot of current efforts going on and increasing attention over the last several months and even weeks. And we want to acknowledge that and build on those current efforts to move things forward. And to do so, we'd like to identify opportunities to standardize patient data inputs for use in research and value assessment. Another opportunity we'd like to look for are opportunities to improve patient inputs through a prioritized research agenda and really try to move it forward so that we make sure that our research agenda is matching up with what's important to patients and that we're moving forward in trying to capture what's important to patients. So one thing to think about here as we look at this is what should we think about first? The purpose of the data collection and the decisions that it's going to influence, or the patient and their family and the data that we need to collect there? And I think what we really need to think about is what's the mesh between those two? Can we find an area where we're collecting what is important to patients and families, and that data is then being pulled through and being used meaningfully in decision-making and value assessment and health technology assessment? And to do that, we've created an agenda for today. We're going to start out with a keynote address from Dana Gelb-Sofrin. And then we'll follow that up with 3 different panels. One of the first panels will be looking at what is important and why is it important. And we'll hear from some patients and patient advocates on that. In the second panel, we'll talk about, for what decisions do we need this data and what data are needed for those decisions? And most importantly, where are the gaps in that data? And then finally, we'll have a panel that looks at how the methods align with patients at purpose, really saying how do we measure and incorporate such data? So what are the opportunities for improving our data collection and our use of that data, and where can we fill in the gaps? And so we'd like you to think about that as we go through today. And we're looking forward to a lot of participation from our panelists and further dialogue.